Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and this is a Citroen DS5. As a lover of older Citroens, I've often wondered if the modern cars retain even a slither of what made the original DS so special. Let's find out. I've always been intrigued as to why Citroen has tried to spin off DS as a completely different sub-brand, and in particular, what they were thinking when they designed this car. Let's start by talking about a few of the good bits, and then we can move on to a couple of spectacularly odd decisions that were made when this was first launched. The original DS was an absolutely incredible car. It was so far ahead of the game that 50 years later, or now it must be 60, 70 years after it was launched, it still has some features that were pretty high tech. The way it looked as well was very, very special. Not only was it akin to a spaceship for the time, but it's an incredibly timeless, beautiful design. Certainly not quite the same can be said about the DS5, but we have to bear in mind that with modern legislation for safety, aerodynamics and so on, modern designers simply can't make cars that are completely radically different from anything else. With that in mind, I think that Citroen's engineers and designers did a pretty good job with the DS5. It really is unlike almost anything else on the road. It has echoes, I suppose, of some of the Renault products of before, like the Avantime and the Velsatis. But you know, what is it? It's a kind of a coupe, an MPV, a hatchback, I don't know. It's a pretty handsome car, and it has some beautiful detailing on it as well. The way the sort of chrome whiskers and wings go up the side of the bonnet. The lights are supposed to be quite jewel-like, and they are. They also have a lovely sort of pattern decoration on the top. In the same way, they've tried to make the interior pretty special as well. It's got some lovely touches. They call this a cockpit-style interior. I'm not sure how much it really does feel like an aeroplane, but it certainly feels very different. So you have here these sort of shark tooth buttons on the sides. You have a load of controls on the top of the roof. Some lovely open individual roof panels, front and back, which make it feel quite airy. An old style clock, which works quite well with the more modern theme generally of the interior. But to me, overall, it's quite a pleasing effect. The materials as well are really good quality. You've got some nice soft touch plastics, but also some other bits of trim and so on, which I think are from the same suppliers that do Aston's interiors as well. The graphics on the dials are interesting, and you have other little bits like these little cubby holes for your sunglasses. And it's not just surface deep either, because looking at the back, even in the interior lights are really nicely finished. Feels like they made a real effort. Likewise, the watch strap seats, they're distinctive. I know some people at the time didn't like them, perhaps. I don't mind them. Overall then, I would say that this does stand up to what Citroen called their radical luxury concept. It's a car that is pretty handsome, it looks very different, and with an interior that is distinctive and yet pretty luxurious. So all good so far. But this is when things start to go a little bit wrong, because when it was first released, they made a couple of very big mistakes. Now, this was supposed to be competing in the same area as the BMW 3 Series and the Audi A4. And yet, the chassis that they use for this is based on the one from the Citroen C4, not the C5, which would be the right kind of class. So the chassis that this is riding on is essentially a Focus class chassis. They just lengthened it, but there was two issues with that. There isn't as much room in the back as you would have liked. But more importantly, the C4 used torsion beam rear suspension. For a car like this, you should have a multi-link or a wishbone or something like that. They also tuned the suspension very, very strangely. I believe that Citroen, having had this history of making cars with an absolutely plush ride, were a little bit worried that they were coming up with this DS sub-brand. They wanted to compete with the Germans, and they needed to move away from this thing about French cars not really being built to drive fast, but, you know, being incredibly comfortable. So what they did with this goes completely at odds with the whole concept of the car, the radical luxury, the special looks, the costing interior. They made it ride extremely stiffly. That could have worked if this was a sports car, but right from the off, with the rather unsophisticated chassis and the steering, which just doesn't encourage a sporty setup, all they did was make a car which just wasn't as comfortable as it should have been, and it was quite pilloried for that when it was first launched. There are, though, two distinctive sort of eras to the DS5. When it was launched as the Citroen DS5 is when it had that particularly bad ride. It was then relaunched in 2015, 4 years later, as a distinct DS, which again, it's a weird thing for me, I think, that they did. I know that they're trying to move up market and they thought maybe taking Citroen out of it would have helped. But at the same time, they changed the suspension, they retuned it, they made it softer, they used some upgraded dampers so that the new cars like this one ride well. I have to tell you though, although it is better than the previous cars, it's still not great. I think over more gentle undulations, it's quite nice, it's quite well controlled, but it still isn't very adept at dealing with the more jarring, smaller breakups in the road. I don't know if you saw about 20-30 seconds ago, I don't know if the camera was shaking, I don't know if it will show on screen or not, but this is a bumpy bit of road, but it really did fall apart over that section. When it's not so bad like here, it's perfectly acceptable. Something else I'm picking up, especially as I go over bumps, is that the resistance on the steering seems to be inconsistent. I don't know if that's factual or if it's just my perception, but when you're turning, you don't always get the same weighing, and that's not just at different speeds. In any way, it just feels a little bit artificial. Another big issue in its quest to match the Germans was that in the early cars especially, the powertrains were a little bit lacking. So the diesels were not quite as refined as their German rivals, and they weren't as efficient either. From 2015 for this car, they improved at least on the efficiency, I think perhaps a little bit on the smoothness. I would say that not class leading, but pretty much acceptable. This has the 2 litre with 180 horsepower. It's pretty responsive. It's got the automatic gearbox, which I think suits the DS5, and I believe is only available with this powertrain, or maybe also there was 150 horsepower diesel as well, which used it. We're coming back onto that bit of road, which is bumpy, and it really isn't very good on this. You can feel the wheels are almost sort of pattering, but you will only experience this on the absolutely worst roads. For most people, it won't be an issue. It does throw up the limitations of this chassis. So, you know, it's raining quite hard, but even in this weather, it has reasonable grip. The steering, though, as in the original versions, is fairly lifeless. The general handling is pretty neutral at normal speeds, but it never feels like a sports car. So it has been a perennial challenge for European car makers, or for other European car makers, how to match the Germans. The Italians have struggled, as have the French, and I think with this attempt, Citroen didn't quite hit the nail on the head. There's a lot to recommend it, and I think now, if you're buying one of these as a second-hand car, well, that's pretty good. When they were new, they were matching the Germans in price as well. And I think going back, you could see why they didn't sell very many of them. They also depreciated very, very badly. That means that you can pick one up now, though, for very little money in comparison to what you're getting. I feel a little bit sorry for Citroen because I think they got some things really quite right. The exterior design is pretty good. The interior is successful as well. But then, in terms of the engine and the overall ethos of the car, they got it completely wrong. So it's as if they couldn't decide what they were making. Were they making a luxury car? Were they trying to make a sports car? The Ride originally obviously was completely at odds with that. They did make a car which had good body control, but the rest of it, the power units, the steering, didn't match up to that. So it just didn't work at all. This version works a lot better. You know, maybe it's not a complete success, but is it special enough? Does it evoke the DS in any way? Directly, the answer is no. It doesn't really evoke the DS in every way. It's not, you know, it's not groundbreaking in terms of technology, but where there is a bit of a link to the DS is that they managed to make something which is very, very different inside and out. Also, I guess it's fitting that the power units weren't quite up to scratch, because that was the only area in which the DS was let down. It was originally designed to come with 6-cylinder engines, but they ran out of money and used the quite old pushrod 4 cylinders. Thank you very much to Wouter and William for bringing this down to me today. It was interesting to drive a modern car. I'm not generally a fan of anything modern, but I think Citroen went as far as they could to try and make this feel special. Thank you to you for watching. If there's one of your cars that you want me to do a review on, please get in touch and we can see if we can arrange anything. Thank you and see you soon.